And the documentary partly examines the forces behind that movement. And director Wendy Sachs is here in Australia, and I spoke with her a little earlier. Wendy, so great to finally meet you here in Australia. Welcome.
Thank you so much for having me.
Now, what made you decide to make this film, and how early on did you realise something like this needed to be documented?
Really, it was on October 8th that I saw what was happening in Times Square in New York, in Australia, when I saw what was happening in front of the Sydney Opera House, in the streets of London, where we saw Hamas being celebrated as freedom fighters rather than being condemned as terrorists. And we saw what was happening on college campuses. On October 8th, you had 30 student groups at Harvard had signed on to a letter blaming Israel for the attack on itself, as if Israel had it coming. And we saw that at campus after campus after campus. There was so much hostility pointed at Israel before Israel had even retaliated. But it was that mixed with the silence coming from the world, silence coming from Hollywood, silence coming from women's rights organizations and from UN Women. It was that combination, and silence from groups that, by the way, speak out of every other social injustice, but didn't have the words to speak out about the brutality that the Israelis had just faced, about women being raped and tortured and kidnapped and mutilated. But it was that combination that made me, I knew that I needed to create this film. So it was within 2 weeks of October 7th that I got to work. I wrote a treatment and I started booking people for the film.
Wow, I mean, it's incredible that it was that early on. I mean, we were all around the world, as you say, even in Australia, with those protests on the steps of the Opera House. You know, any reasonably minded Australian, and certainly the Jewish community, was still grieving from October 7, and then we couldn't understand why there was this protest movement against Israel, against the victims that was arising around the world. Now, one of the things you delve into in your documentary is the power of the social media algorithms. Can you tell us a bit about that?
What we expose in the film is that these algorithms are being manipulated, and they're being manipulated by foreign actors in Iran and in Russia and China, that these are not authentic. There are bot farms that are controlling what people are seeing, what young people are seeing on TikTok. We show this sort of 54-to-1 ratio, 54 being the pro-Palestinian, pro-Hamas hashtags that are coming out versus the pro-Israel or anything that's sympathetic to Israel hashtags. And we can see that it really varies between TikTok and Instagram and the other platforms. So we know that it's not authentic.
So just to explain that, when you say 54-to-1, you're saying for every one piece of
pro-Israel, that's right. For every one hashtag that's pro-Israel, there are 54 times pro-Hamas, pro-Palestinian hashtags being sent out. And so what young people are seeing, those who are on TikTok, they're seeing just a distorted amount of content that is really presenting the pro-Hamas, pro-Palestinian narrative. And it's just not authentic, and it's being controlled. And we know that foreign actors are trying to atomize the American population, not just in America, by the way, but I would argue throughout the West, that there's someone who has their finger on the scale, countries who want to separate populations. We saw this with the 2016 campaign in America, the presidential campaign. We see it around the world in all sorts of conflicts. It's not just the Israeli-Palestinian one, but we know that there really is a foreign influence, and there's a reason that they're targeting young people. There's a propaganda campaign that's out there, and it's distorting the reality. It's making young people believe mistruths about actually what's happening.
One of the themes that I think we need to do a better job in the media of explaining is, this idea, and a lot of anti-Semites do it. They say, oh no, we're not expressing anti-Semitism, this is just anti-Zionism. And that was one of the themes you explored as well, that actually the two are now largely indistinguishable.
That's right. So what we show in the film is that anti-Semitism has morphed over the generations. And the latest form of that is a fanatical anti-Zionism. And so make no mistake, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. Delegitimizing the state of Israel is anti-Semitic. When you exclude Israel, when you make Israel the pariah state among nations, that is anti-Semitism. And we're not talking about politics. We're not talking about arguing against the policies of the Bibi Netanyahu government. This is not what this is about. The film is not political. The film is not litigating the war. But the film is explaining what anti-Semitism is today, and that is anti-Zionism.
Of course, because when we hear phrases like from the river to the sea, I mean, that's saying that there should be no Jews at all in Israel, which is the main message that's being perpetuated.
That's right. And you hear those chants on college campuses. I would be standing in groups, mobs, at protests at Columbia University, at MIT, and what you're hearing is they're chanting for one state, we want it all, 1948. That's what they're chanting. They're not saying we want peace. They're not saying we want two states. You know, we would have no film if that's what the students were chanting at these rallies. But they're saying we want it all. River to the sea, we want it all. That means no Jews.
You had a really beautiful chat with Sarah Murdoch at the first screening, the sneak peek of your documentary last night, and she asked you about your message of hope at the end. I have to say, I really struggle to see, where this ends. It feels like it's just the beginning of a new wave of anti-Semitism that's been such a shock for all of us. Why do you feel hopeful? Why is there any reason for any of us to feel hopeful?
I know that it feels really dark and bleak and grim, and there's been a lot of anti-Semitism here in Australia, fire bombings of synagogues and daycare centers, graffiti, swastikas, all of it, kill the Jews. It can feel really dark. What gives me hope are the young people, and we highlight so many young people in the film, and these young people are extraordinary. They have such a strong sense of identity. They know who they are. They're speaking out. They're being vocal. They have a moral clarity and a courage about them. They give me hope. But we also end the film on allyship, because let's be clear, this is not just about the Jews or the state of Israel. In fact, I would argue it's not about that at all. It begins with the Jews, but it doesn't end with the Jews. We are talking about jihadism and extremism versus democracy in the West.
Absolutely.
That's the big issue here, and we need our allies. And we end the film on our allyship with the Black community and the Christian community and the evangelical community and all the indigenous community, all of the various communities. We can't fight this alone. And I know, and I am optimistic, and I am hopeful that outside of the Jewish community, we have allies who want to also fight down this hate, because they know that it's not just about the Jews. It's about something much bigger. It's about all of us.
Exactly. It's about the values on which our Western democracy, our civilization is built on. Wendy, I have to congratulate you on such a powerful film, so confronting to watch, but every moment of it was truly gripping. Thank you for being here.
Thank you so much for having me.